Hi everyone, welcome back out to Harvest Hill's Ranch. Many individuals make decisions about adding plants to their diet because they're seeking out the components of those plants that are deemed beneficial. We often hear that whether it's things like antioxidants or, for example, some of the phenols, flavonoids, things like these that are in plants. Many individuals seek those things out and try to incorporate more plants in their diet to harness those benefits of those compounds. However, what I'm going to share with you today is a way to still gather the benefits of those compounds, but maybe shift the amount of plants that you're eating in your diet or increase the opportunity for other food components, other categories of food to come into your diet that maybe you enjoy more, maybe you enjoy less, I don't know, but it's just a different way to think about your diet. Hey, I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I have a passion for nutrition. And if you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We talk about everything as it relates to nutrition here. Out at Harvest Hills Ranch, we take pride in producing high nutrient-dense food and making the decisions that drive that, and all the way up to the point that getting that food into my patients' hands and helping them make decisions long-term about how nutrition is going to impact their health. Those are all the things we talk about around here. So if that's of interest to you, make sure you come back. So before we get started today, I wanted to share an opportunity that I recently had in the last few days to visit the Regen Ranch. You'll note the hat today, Regen Ranch. And I want to thank the owner of Regen Ranch, Miss Christine Martin. And Christine put together a great event that hosted a number of farmers and producers to get together and to have an opportunity to learn about soil health, animal nutrition, human nutrition, and see how all these things interplay with each other. I had an opportunity to be the closing speaker for this event, and I shared the stage with Dr. Provenza and Dr. Stephan Van Vliet, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that I learned from them that I think are going to be very insightful for you and maybe give you a new way of thinking about your diet. But before I do that, I want to share this short little clip with you from my presentation that maybe will get you thinking.
So let me ask you a few questions to get you thinking on this. Does egg yolk color reflect the health of the animal? Maybe, maybe not. Should egg yolks be the same color during all seasons?
So that's just a small snippet of the information I shared with those farmers and ranchers. And if you want to see more about my conversation with them about what egg yolk color actually means, stay tuned for future videos because I'm going to delve into that topic as well. So on to the main focus of our conversation today, which is going to be secondary metabolites in plants. Let me first start out by talking about what these are, what they do, why we should even care about these. Secondary metabolites are compounds that help plants adapt to the environment that they're in. And plants are going to produce different quantities of these. They're going to produce different ones among different species of plants. These are going to have more technical names, which we do hear more of these names being used now, so maybe they're not so foreign to us. But things like terpenes, tannins, alkaloids, phenols. Some of you may have heard of things like polyphenols and flavonoids. They fall under that category. These are the type of compounds that we're talking about. And they're going to have different roles. Sometimes they carry out protective roles. So, for example, if a plant is being attacked by an insect or a group of insects, then they're going to release more of these compounds. They inhibit the consumption of that plant by the insect. They're protective mechanisms. Like I said, they help the plant adapt. They're going to help the plant interact with the microbial community around it in a beneficial way. So there's a lot of different mechanisms on these. Now, that's all for the plant kingdom, but the real emphasis on these has been around human nutrition and what effect they have on human physiology. And the impact here has been pretty broad spectrum as well. We see that these are often termed things like antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. We also see that they have antimicrobial effects. For example, if someone's having an overgrowth of bacteria or fungus or even parasites in the body, that these plants will help reduce that microbial load. Some of this even comes from, the thought process comes from Aborigine or native populations in areas where they use botanical or herbal medicine, and these were the constituents that were available in the plants, and the reason that they were selecting those plants is because they could control microbes. They also have anti-carcinogenic type of effects as well. Some of these do, and what that means is that they're going to inhibit the progression or onset of cancer. And point being here is that there's a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of reasons that we as humans would want to consider using these. Now, more times than not, we tend to think about a direct route of consumption here, where we consume the plant has the compound in it, we start to digest that plant, we break it down, and we allow those compounds to be assimilated into our body. Sometimes the attribute of these compounds doesn't have anything to do with assimilation at all. Sometimes the attribute has to do with the localized effect that that compound has in the gastrointestinal tract and the positive benefit that it has for our bacteria, for our overall microbiota in the GI tract. So there are multiple mechanisms here, but these are all a byproduct of direct consumption. However, there is a thought process around this, and we do see this play out in the clinical environment, where when we directly consume these plants, keep in mind, the reason that oftentimes they're producing these compounds is for a protective effect. And there may be the impact of that protective effect on us as humans. I often hear from patients that are focusing on plants in their diet. They're trying to consume more of these to try to gain the benefits of that, whether they see that as the fiber component or whether they see that as the attribute of consuming these secondary metabolites. But what they ultimately find is that they just don't feel good when they consume these. They may feel fatigued, lethargic. They may feel that they have some gastrointestinal distress. Some individuals may find that their stool characteristics begin to change. There's all a plethora of effects that can play out here. And sometimes on the opposite end of the spectrum, individuals feel good by consuming these plants. So we don't look at this as a one-size-fits-all type of an approach. But for those individuals that do feel the negative effect of consuming these plants, often this has to do with the concentration or the total quantity of those secondary metabolites in those plants. And therefore, it leads us to another consideration, which is there a way to get these secondary metabolites in indirectly? Is there a way to get them in where we don't see negative effects associated with their consumption, or there's not some type of ill effect associated with their consumption? And the answer to that is that is possible. Now, the short answer to that may be just simply don't eat as much of it or don't eat it as frequently, but we can think broader than that. And this is where we start to see animal foods come into the conversation. Now, with these animal foods, for the purpose of our conversation here today, I'm going to focus specifically on ruminant animals, animals that have a rumen as part of their digestive process. And to speak more specifically, if you're not familiar with which animals fall under that category, it's going to be things like cows, sheep, goats, bison. Those are the main food sources that we start to think about that are ruminant animals. Now, their digestive system, the rumen is essentially a fermentation area where you have a large diversity of microorganisms in there, and as that forage, better stated, comes in, that forage is going to undergo microbial fermentation such that the animal is given access to the constituents in that food, whether it's the secondary metabolites, whether it's the amino acids in that food, whether it's the energy that comes around from that forage source. So point being is that those secondary metabolites are only released if we have good microbial fermentation from that rumen area. Now, in regards to this indirect route, there's been a bit of a change in thought process on this. So in years gone by, if I would have said to you that animal foods, specifically pasture-based animal foods, animals, for example, grass-finished cows, that they have high antioxidants, we would have predominantly been talking about things like vitamin A, vitamin E, maybe glutathione, maybe selenium and zinc would have come into the conversation. But we can expand our thought process out beyond that. Now, it doesn't mean those things aren't beneficial, and those nutrients are found in higher concentrations in grass-finished animals. But we can expand our conversation out to these secondary metabolites. And a lot of this has to do with how these animals are finished and how these animals are handled through the pasture management process. The difference on these we hear these differences between the grain-fed animal and the grass-fed animal, and in reality what that means is that we're talking about an animal that's fed in a feedlot system with grain versus an animal that's finished in a pasture-based system. And we know that these are the two predominant finishing methods across the globe, and they do have different effects on the animal. As we have more research, we're beginning to see that the list of differences does seemingly continue to grow. And again, this used to be a conversation about mostly fatty acid differences. For example, the pasture animal having higher omega-3s, the grain-fed animal having higher omega-6s. But the conversation's broader than that now. In terms of these secondary metabolites, what we see is that when an animal goes into a feedlot system, the longer they're in that feedlot system and the longer they're consuming grains, the greater the decline in their secondary metabolite composition in the meat. In contrast to that, when we look at an animal that is on a pasture-based system, we find that these animals are going to have a higher plane of secondary metabolites. They're going to have a much greater quantity of these secondary metabolites in the final meat product. There's some other factors that influence this as well, but in general, if we look for an optimization, we're talking about the last anywhere from 3 to 4 months, that 3 to 4 months of life for that animal, and what that animal is consuming in that time frame is going to have the greatest impact on what's in the final meat product that we consume. So if that animal's been in their last 3 to 4 months of life on predominantly grain, we're not going to see a high secondary metabolite concentration, in contrast to them being on a pasture-based system where they've had a diversity of forage for their last 3 to 4 months of life. We are going to see a much greater secondary metabolite concentration. Now, there's some other things that play into this, and one is going to be the differences in the pasture itself. When we look at the pastures, if we're looking at the difference between what's known as a monoculture pasture versus a polyculture pasture, a monoculture pasture is going to be one predominant species of forage out there. Usually it's one predominant species of grass. Sometimes it can be a legume, but a simple way of looking at this is that if you only have one species predominating in that pasture, that is all the animal has in front of them to be able to gain secondary metabolites from. If we contrast that against a polyculture pasture where that animal has a number of different forage sources to consume, for example, they do have grasses, and maybe they have multiple types of grasses. They have forbs out in front of them, what a lot of people like to think about as weeds. But by the way, guys, these weeds do have medicinal value to them. We also see legumes in this category. Some individuals might think about this as beans, but it's a broader category than just beans. But the idea here is that the greater the number of species that animal consumes in each one of those categories, the more exposure to these secondary metabolites that they're going to have. As that concentration of secondary metabolites continues to increase in that food source, that ultimately means that when we as humans consume that food source, now we're getting a greater concentration of those secondary metabolites in that food source that we consume. And again, we're doing this by not consuming a plant, but by consuming an animal source. The other thing that is unique in this conversation as well is that if you and I were to go out into that same pasture that animal is finishing on, and we were to try to consume those plants, the reality is that the plants that animal is consuming, if we consume those, we're not going to see any benefit from doing that. And in fact, we could have potentially induced harm for ourselves. So what that means is that when that animal consumes that plant and that plant goes through the rumen, now we've unlocked secondary metabolites in that landscape that that animal is foraging on, that then we as humans can start to benefit from. That if we had tried to go out there and do that, we would have never seen the benefit from being able to get those forages consumed and broken down in our system. Our gastrointestinal tract is not as complex as those ruminants are. So it does matter how many plants are out in the pasture, how many different species there are out in the pasture. One of the things that we personally do here at Harvest Hills Ranch, one of the things that I manage for, is I want a polyculture. I don't kill anything out there. I let the animals consume that. Whatever's in front of them, that's what they're eating. Sometimes when we take them around into some of the wooded areas that we forage around, near and actually into, the animals will eat on the shrubs. They'll eat browse. They'll even reach up into the trees sometimes and eat some of the things out of the trees that are low hanging that they can reach to. So it's a multitude of things that they have access to, and sometimes these things have anti-parasitic activity. It's a way of that animal being able to control their parasites. Maybe they ate something that didn't necessarily agree with them, and they can eat another food to help offset that negative effect of the first forage they consume. So animals are very instinctual. They have the ability to be able to work through the forage that's in front of them to ultimately make the decision of what's best for them. Instinctually, they're a lot better than we as humans are. Us as humans, we don't have that capacity. Now, there's one other point in this that I do want to bring up, which is the change of seasons. And this has a direct impact on foraging as well. And changes of season, let me give you a visual illustration on this. When we look at the landscape in spring and summer, we note that it's very vibrant. There's a lot of life. There's a lot of color in the environment. We see that the greens are the plants that are green, they're very dark, rich green. Whereas if you compare that against the fall and the winter, where we're seeing that the environment is, the plants are going dormant, we see that either the plant goes into a brown stage, a brown coloration, it's dropping its foliage. And maybe if it's in the northern states, we see that there's going to be more white in the environment because of snow and ice. And ultimately what this means is that the production of the secondary metabolites in those plants is not going to be as great as it is in those warmer months. And this was something that Dr. Van Vliet brought forward, that they had noticed from the research that he's been doing, is that there is this definitive change with the secondary metabolites through the change of seasons. So that can be another factor that can ultimately affect what the final content in the meat source is. What is the conclusion that we draw from all this? Well, first of all, one of the things that we can draw from this is that this can be an opportunity for us to shift our diet. If we're looking to try to maintain these beneficial secondary metabolites in our diet, because we do want the anti-inflammatory effect, which who doesn't want that? Or we do want the antioxidative longevity effect. Of course we want these things. No one wants to develop cancer, so yes, we want to be exposed to things that are anti-carcinogenic, and we want to have a good balance of microbiota in our gut. We hear all the time how important the gastrointestinal tract is, and these secondary metabolites ultimately help us maintain that balance in our gastrointestinal tract. So of course we want all these benefits. But now what we're talking about is an opportunity to gain some of these same benefits from animal-based foods and not necessarily feel like we have to overconsume the plant-based category of foods, or if you're an individual that doesn't feel comfortable after consuming those foods, now we've got an opportunity to reduce those in our diet without any associated guilt and consume animal-based foods in its place and yield the benefit from those. So I think this is a very interesting thought process in terms of what we have access to now from the animal-based foods, and it certainly changes our perspective on what health benefits these foods can ultimately have. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to conclude here today. Hey, if you are looking for pasture-raised grass-fed and finished beef, if you're looking for pastured poultry, pasture free-range eggs, duck eggs, chicken eggs, hey, that's what we do out at Harvest Hills Ranch. We put an emphasis on nutrient-dense food. And if you're interested in what I do in the clinic, then go to drarlandhill.com. You'll be able to find out more valuable information there and also about the resources that I have available for you as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to join. Again, I appreciate Christine at the Regen Ranch for setting up the event for us. That was just such an insightful event this past week. And I appreciate the knowledge and expertise of the doctors that I had the opportunity to share the stage with and the other presenters that I learned from by taking our pasture walk as well. So with that all being said, guys, listen, make sure that you come back to the channel. I'm going to be bringing you more information very much in line with what we're talking about here, talking about how nutrition and the different aspects of nutrition and how you can harness its benefit. I'm Dr. Arland Hill. Until next time, take care, everyone.